We liked this case enough that we made a custom 3D animation to explain some of the airflow behaviors. We found this peculiar airflow pattern that formed where when we added side intake, it dramatically hurt the GPU thermal performance, even though it helped the CPU. So this is the wood-fronted A3-mATX. The A3-mATX came out in this variant earlier this year. But one of the things that we like about this case is that it is really easy to pull apart. So panels all pop off quickly. And internally, it is one of the most bare bones minimalistic cases that we've worked with anytime recently, but in a good way. In a way that it's a huge amount of space in a relatively confined footprint. It's also heavily ventilated on every panel, except for on the original one, the front panel, which is just this really cheap plastic, unfortunately. Now the wood one has a fractal-inspired wooden front panel, which is actually perforated. So that's a pretty big difference from the original A3-mATX, which came out only a few months ago. If you look at that, there's a dust filter included in it, magnetic, and then underneath it, mesh behind the mostly obstructing wooden slats. It's also $70 for the plastic fronted version and $85 for the new wooden fronted one. It ends up being one of the cheapest cases we've reviewed anytime recently, which is good, because the budget market is actually still pretty strong, especially if you're buying last-gen parts. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Aeronaut and Hydronaut thermal pastes. Aeronaut is Thermal Grizzly's entry-level thermal solution, marketed as resistant to curing and for long-term endurance. Hydronaut is Thermal Grizzly's next step up, targeted for overclocking and higher performance applications. We've used Hydronaut on a lot of our systems internally over the years. You can learn more at the link in the description below. And in spite of the $70 price point, the case actually manages to avoid feeling cheap. So this top panel has this radius on the edges that really helps reinforce it, so you don't get that cheap stamped steel wobbling sort of noise you'll typically get on cases with cheap stamped steel. The side panels have almost 2mm thick inner framing that traces the entire inside of the border here, which gives it some structural support to also help with some of the feeling of quality, with one exception, which is that I noticed this particular one, now that we've been working with it for a while, has developed quite the bend. Now it will, if we just even let it rest, not pressed into either side. Still a bend, it will press in and straighten itself out, but that is maybe one of the few areas where it starts to look a little cheap, again with the exception of this panel. But this one's fixed with the wooden fronted one that we prefer. Now, going micro-ATX gives a lot of options for a broader range of components versus something like an ITX case, but these ITX cases like the Terra add a lot of complexity where they're trying to cram so much into a small spot that normally the price grows. And so m-atx often, but not always, helps with price, and it also still makes it easy to build and gives you a ton of the space you would normally see on ATX. And m-atx has really become a lot more viable over the years, with the one exception of video card size posing kind of a new challenge that they're tackling now. So anyway, overall, we do like the A3-mATX. We're gonna take an in-depth look at it today. There's some interesting thermal characteristics. There's a few things we don't like too, so let's get started. All right, so the A3-mATX is clearly intended to be a budget case, which is great. I like reviewing budget things. We don't get a ton of them these days that are actually quality. So it's good to look at something that is cheaper. 70 to 85 bucks, not bad for a case, even though it's smaller. Now, it's almost entirely stamped steel. It has few accessories, and it doesn't come with much other than the case itself and a box of screws. So that simplicity can be a good thing, especially when it helps control cost. They do sell some extras as DLC though. First of all, the new front panel can be bought separately for $24 for those who already bought the original case. That makes it $10 more than the price difference if you were to just start with the wooden front panel one. And there's also a vertical GPU kit for 50 bucks, which is a proportionally massive jump for a baseline $70 to $85 case. There's also a glass side panel for $13. Now for the glass front and for the vertical GPU mount, we would recommend against using them at the same time, because as soon as you put the glass front panel in there and you verticalize the GPU, is that a verb? It is now. Once you verticalize the GPU and put this in there, it's going to suffocate the video card for air. We would not recommend using both of these. You'd want to keep the mesh. One other small thing too on this, notice before filming, now that this has been sitting for about a month, that this really collects and shows dust, because that off-white plus just the material, it sort of attracts it more than other materials. So something to keep in mind. The vertical GPU mount, though, in general, for this reason, is not something we're particularly fond of, but we're going to come back to that later. So, to get everyone up to speed, some of the competition looks like this. Fractal's Pop Air Mini RGB is $60 on sale and includes 3 fans. It's a much larger case, but competitive on price and still micro-ATX. Sama is a supplier in the industry, but also sells to consumers. Its ARGB Q5 is also $60 with 3 fans. They also have an IM01 Pro at $62, and then an AR01 RGB at $70. Montech is selling its Air 100 m-atx case for $70 with 4 fans. Thermaltake's View 170 is also $70 with 3 fans. And Asus's AP201 is available at $75 without fans. Lian Li's own O11 Air Mini is a large, more expensive alternative to the A3 today, and Thermaltake's Versa H18 would be another, this one at $55. Compared to the preceding A4H2O at $150, the $70 to $85 price of the A3 is aggressive. That's true too of the SSU PD Mushroom D at $100, and both the A4 and the Mushroom are also manufactured by Lian Li, but are limited to ITX motherboards. Dimensions for the A3 m-atx are pretty large compared to the A4. It's 456 by 194 by 322 millimeters, coming into 28.5 liters in volume, which is larger than the claimed 26 liters on the spec sheet, because we actually measure things like the case's feet protrusions, because it's part of the case. The A3 m-atx is heavily ventilated across the entire chassis, including the top panel, both sides, and with the wood model also on the front, but not the plastic model. The back also has large gaps in its ventilation for another fan mount, with even more holes punched out of the bottom. The only true solid panel is, again, on the non-wood variant with that front panel. Otherwise, there's holes everywhere. Now, the A3 m-atx technically has 10 spots for fans in it, so it's got support for, Lian Li says, 360 millimeter radiators and obviously the fans in the top, bottom, and side, which we'll come back to the side mount option. And then there's also room in the back for a fan, and you might be able to force a fan into the front of the new panel, but we're not going to spend time on that yet. For the radiators, if you were to put a radiator in the floor, couple things. First of all, if it's open loop, no problem, doesn't matter. If it's a closed loop solution, then anything where the pump is in the block, that is going to be a problem. It's much more likely to die. You should never have the pump be the highest point of the loop. That matters the most out of anything with the orientation of it. If it's the highest point, good chance it dies pretty quickly. If the pump is in the radiator or in the tubes, it's okay. But just something to be aware of your limitations there. One thing we noticed here though, this is a 120 millimeter wide radiator. You could imagine if we tried to put a 140 mil wide radiator in here with its fans, they would collide with the motherboard VRM heatsink. So not fully compatible with this setup. It's going to depend on the motherboard you buy too. Now, the last thing is the interesting one, which is where the rest of the fans come from, because we haven't actually covered all 10 yet, and that's going to be this included but optional side fan mount, where this has a foot here that hooks in to the side of the case like that, and that's where they go. Now, what's interesting is this configuration puts the fans above the video card in a way that can actually harm the GPU performance. It seems counterintuitive, but let's get ahead of ourselves for a moment from the thermal testing later in this review and look at a chart. This chart shows the side configuration with 2 intake fans and a top exhaust liquid cooler as compared against the system with just top exhaust, no extra fans, and against 2 bottom intake fans with top exhaust. This is with the plastic front, not the wood front. We'll look at that one later. The impact to GPU thermals is pretty massive here. We measured about an 11-degree drop in average GPU temperature by getting rid of the side intake extra fans. To help make this easier to understand in terms of why it happens, we made a custom 3D animation, and we'll come back to the thermal specifics later. This animation will help explain what we think is happening. When the system's configured with only the top exhaust fans, it's in a negative pressure setup. In PC building terminology, this means that there's more forced outflow from the case perspective than there is intake. As a result, air will naturally try to reach equilibrium, and it'll find its way through every hole in the case, but especially the 2 closest ones. There's a large empty fan mount at the back, and then there's the empty mesh on the left side panel. The air flows straight in and mostly right out of the liquid cooler through its fans. As for the GPU, its fans are closest to the bottom and to the unused PCI slot covers in the back. This is where the GPU will pull its air in, so it'll be fed cool exterior air directly from the outside within mere centimeters of the outside of the case. That's great for the GPU. When we add two side intake fans to this configuration, especially two which will have a greater pressure than the exhaust fans, everything changes. The exhaust fans are already battling resistance from the radiator, so the two side intake fans will end up creating a new pressure system. Now, air immediately outside the mesh panel will instead find itself pulled towards the fans and shot into them and then into the case above the GPU. This will greatly benefit CPU cooling, as you'll see in our test later. The downside of this is that the lower third of that side panel, which previously was feeding the video card through its own fans, is now less utilized for the video card. Instead, most of that air will move either into the fans directly that are mounted to the side, or will draft up and into the case as it's pulled in by other currents. The end result is that most of this lower third side intake no longer feeds the video card, suffocating it for air. Instead, the video card is left to only pull from the bottom. It also isn't pulling air in through the PCIe slot covers anymore, and will instead be exhausting air out of them as a result of this pressure change. There's more resistance for air to come in than for it to go out in this situation, so naturally it'll want to find its way out of the computer. Likewise, the flow through of the GPU is now facing a pillar of air coming in perpendicularly, which will reduce the speed at which the air coming out of the video card can find an exit of this area of the case. If we remove those two side fans, the original layout allowed a straight column of air to form from the flow through to the top exhaust fans, efficiently removing air from the middle ground. If this animation helped you understand why the thermals are worse for the GPU with the side intake fans, please consider supporting our ever-expanding efforts to grow the educational aspect of our channel on store.gamersnexus.net, where you can grab one of our freshly restocked 4-packs of our original coaster pack design. These include our fan design coaster, which has been one of the most popular. We're sold out of these for a couple years and finally restocked them, so if you've been waiting, now's your chance. And of course, as usual, every configuration is going to be a little different, so depending on the components you choose, the fans you choose, the video card you have, these things could change. But at least in our test setup, this is why we see the results we do. So that's how we think the physics is playing out with the airflow. Now back to the case itself, it's pretty big. In fact, this is the A4, that's the A3. The A3 is big enough that it can fit an A4 inside of it. So the A3 is not a true successor to the A4, but it doesn't seem like that was their intent. It's doing something else. Internally, there's enough space to install a custom water cooling loop without going completely insane from fitment issues. You could maybe even do dual 360s. It also fits much larger modern video cards, and of course, it brings the price floor down because micro-ATX boards are often pretty cheap. Moving to the front panel of the new one, the wood version has an easily removable dust filter retained with magnets. There's no extra fan mount with the new front panel, but even if you forced one to fit, most of the mesh is obstructed by wood anyway. So we wouldn't view it as an intended area of active airflow. Coming back to the power supply, the case can support SFX and ATX power supplies up to 220 millimeters long on the right or front walls using a slightly clumsy mounting bracket. The vertical rails alternatively support an SSD bracket. There's also a strange optional way to mount an ATX PSU to the SSD tray using standoffs. This extreme flexibility results in such a complex web of component compatibility that Lian Li created 9 entire tables for it, separate from the manual. All of this was done without a mess of complicated and customized hardware and brackets, thanks to the departure from a tinier ITX box. For GPUs, technically up to 4 slots thick and 415 millimeters long can fit, depending on where and how long the power supply is. However, when using a GPU this large, be advised that it'll effectively cut the case in half and severely change the airflow patterns. The GPU will be only able to pull from the bottom and the rear PCIe slot covers. It won't really get much from the side if it's a full 4 slots thick, meaning that side intake fans will significantly hurt its performance. When using a vertical GPU bracket that's reduced to 3.5 slots and 355 mil in length, and again, we'd advise against the glass panel for a vertical GPU configuration, It would also reduce CPU cooler access to air. The optional $50 vertical GPU mount is good and bad. It's magnets. On the good side, it's a pretty universal and easy to install design that looks like it could be used in more than one case, as it attaches to the bottom fan mount locations, which are standard 120mm spacing. On the bad side, we think not integrating into the rear I/O of the case itself is a suboptimal solution that makes plugging or unplugging display cables an annoying operation. Even with how infrequent that is in normal use, it requires removing the left side panel and fishing it through the replacement PCIe bracket grommet hole thing, and unfortunately the pass-through doesn't actually line up with the GPU itself, making it that much more awkward. It does work, just not well. NVIDIA's 40 series founders cards have no problem fitting inside the case. The Asus Strix 4090 fits, but would require careful consideration to not put pressure on the power connector. But just because a card fits doesn't mean it should be used in, that was the sound of quality, doesn't mean it should be used in the case, because as soon as you put something that fills most of the space, once again, envision this like two separate compartments at that point, almost like our old SL600 review from Cooler Master, if you want to learn more about how that behaves. Now, despite the clunkiness of the SSD and power supply mounting solution, we like how the tabs at the bottom keep them in place while securing the top with screws. And we found the design simple and functional. There's an additional 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drive mount in the front floor of the case. Using it would block off the forwardmost fan mount, but it is available. Front I/O is good on the case, so it's got USB Type-C, 2 USB-A, and separate microphone and headphone jacks, which is what we prefer in cases. Cable management in general is a weak point on the case. Their approach to cable managing in here appears to be, it's huge, so just put them wherever. But it's not as crafted as the competition. It's less tactical. Tactical cable management is going to be my new strategy game. There are no channels or covers. There isn't any space really behind the motherboard tray. Tie-down points are limited other than the ones you create out of the fan mounting holes if they're unused, and we're left having to basically just bundle them all up into a clump. Similarly, the front panel USB 3 cable is short enough that it could pose some issues for clean cable management when using mini ITX boards depending on where the USB 3 header is. But it wouldn't be a problem with micro-ATX. Installing a liquid cooler in the top of the case also blocks off access to the top edge of the motherboard. We would recommend pre-running those cables first and installing as many as you can before getting the cooler in there. This could have been mitigated with a top fan bracket being removable and allowing for cable adjustment after the fact, but that would likely add cost. Now, white is known to be a challenge in the industry for color matching for getting the different materials to match to each other. And we see that on this case where the back of it, the white on the external power supply pass-through ends up being a little different from the white of the case. Likewise, internally, for the cables and the headers attached to those cables, the white is very slightly different, where we've got kind of an off-white, grayish, I don't know, 1990s Ethernet cable, and then whatever that is. In addition to that, the white on the $50 PCIe riser for the vertical GPU mount is a little different still from the rest of these. That's not necessarily a big deal, but it's different. And it is something that we've heard a lot of case manufacturers, Lian Li included over the years, talk about having challenges color matching everything. It's an extra cost sometimes to spend that time on it. Now, considering the competition of the micro-ATX case market, we favor the wood version of this case. The front panel doesn't feel cheap in the way that the plastic front of the solid panel version does, and you get a little bit of visual flair without going up to the price levels of something like the Fractal North, which is also just a much different case in general. So, time to get into thermals. For our ITX thermal testing, there's always a bit of a caveat here in the explanation, which is that we spend a lot of time doing configuration by configuration testing rather than competitive testing against other cases. There's a lot of reasons for this. We explained it, I think, in our Fractal Terra review previously. The primary one is that ITX, or in this case, not ITX, it's micro-ATX, but we're using the same platform for the testing because the components all fit. In either situation with these smaller builds, they are so custom tailored to the specific case that they're going in that trying to do a competitive head-to-head every time gets a little difficult because you're going to end up hurting the performance of a case that has more room for something in order to fit the smallest common denominator cooler. So instead, we spend all the time doing just A/B comparisons of different configurations of the same case, and we've got a lot of them for this. So let's get into the thermal testing. All tests were performed with a Fractal Lumen 240 closed-loop liquid cooler with the pump and fan set to 100%. Additional fans in these tests were also set to 100% with the 4070 FE fans controlled for all tests. Here's the CPU thermal torture chart. In this testing, baseline stock results between the wood panel and plastic panel ended up about the same. They were 45.5 and 46.1 degrees over ambient, which means they're within error of each other. Testing the base model with top exhaust for the CLC and 2 side intake fans boosted its performance massively, with a huge gain over every other configuration at the top of the chart. The side fans really helped the CPU cooling, despite hurting the GPU cooling. The second best P-core average thermals come from the wood-fronted panel version with the CLC in the top as exhaust, with that configuration also using 2 intake fans in the bottom. This results in 44 degrees Celsius over ambient, with noise levels only marginally different or raised over the base version with its solid front panel and glass side panel. It's clear throughout the results here that the wood front panel with its open mesh areas lets slightly more noise escape the case in general. It's expected. The thermal data leans slightly cooler for those configurations as well, but both the thermal and noise results are indistinguishable and mostly fall within error. Removing the 2 case fans puts the case in wood stock configuration, which is 1.5 degrees warmer and not bad, all things considered. Other configurations filter in below, with the base vertical GPU mount and CLC side exhaust setups last at about 48C over ambient. For GPU thermals, the top non-problematic result from the previous CPU thermals chart is now the leader in GPU temperature at 47 degrees Celsius over ambient. Considering the reasonable 32 dBA noise level in our hemianechoic chamber, we'll point to this configuration as the way to go, unless your aim is to minimize noise as much as possible. Bottom-mounted fans benefit the GPU, unsurprisingly, with the result at 47 degrees GPU core. We see another appearance at 49.8, showing that the glass panel costs us a couple degrees in this layout. There's an interesting 3 degrees Celsius split between the wood front and base versions of the case, favoring wood when the CLC is mounted to the side. Unfortunately, for vertical GPU enjoyers, that configuration was one of the worst, predictably, if not counting the troublesome side intake configuration we talked about earlier. We suspect that recirculation is to blame for parts of this, as the exhaust coming out of both the PCIe slot area and the flow-through area don't have easy ways to get out of the case naturally. Next, we'll take a brief look at RAM and motherboard VRM temperatures. We've started tracking these in case reviews to help understand hot pockets, not that kind, of air buildup around these components. Surprising to nobody, it turns out that intake fans blowing directly at the motherboard is great for the thermals of these components, even in spite of the GPU temperature. Most of the results are within a narrow band of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. Mounting the CLC to the side as exhaust raises both SPD hub temperature and VRM temperatures roughly 5 degrees Celsius higher, so we wouldn't recommend that for users who know they'll be running particularly memory-intensive workloads with hot memory. We think the Lian Li DAN A3-mATX has all of the right ingredients to be a very popular micro-ATX case for the budget classification. So if you don't have a specific reason to go for an ATX case and you're okay with micro-ATX, then we think the A3-mATX is a good solution. The main reasons you might go with ATX would be obviously just the looks. That's a totally valid reason. Maybe you like the way it fills the space better, the look of the build once it's complete, whatever. That's a valid reason. Could also just be stuff. You're maybe putting more expansion cards in there or more drives or something of that nature, custom liquid cooling, something like that. But a reason to consider micro-ATX if you haven't in the past might be that, generally speaking, you can get into it a little bit cheaper than ATX. Not always, but there are a lot of micro-ATX boards on the market that are relatively low cost, and the cases themselves tend to be a little higher quality for the same price once you're in that sub-$100 market, which makes sense because it's less material, so hopefully they can put some of that money towards just using better quality materials instead. The A3-mATX gives a lot of options here. It's fairly inexpensive, 70 to 85 bucks. It has good build quality, we think, in most places, not counting the plastic front on the base version. The wood front backing plastic can feel a little cheap as well, but overall the build quality is good. We also think adding the option for the wood panel was the right move by Lian Li. It raises the perception of quality and it makes it a lot more interesting to look at. We think the execution was completely fine given the $15 price bump if you buy it new, and subjectively we just think it looks way better. The mesh front doesn't make or break the thermal performance, but it was a nice consideration. Now, continuing the quality front of things, so as you saw in this video, Our white right side panel has a little bit of a bend to it now, just from we've had this one longer. It's been through a lot of build cycles. And the black one is actually still pretty sturdy, which this is much newer to our office, and it's really only been opened a few times. So it's tough to say how much the curvature we have in the white one will reflect in every case, especially if you're not assembling and disassembling a lot. Again, it does snap down into place. It's a cheap enough case that we can forgive a little bit of a bend for a panel that's this long and relatively unsupported centrally. Something like the Corsair 6500, when you're $200 plus, there's just no more excuse for that. But this one, we can get over it. It does flatten once you install it. Despite the A3's larger size, it doesn't feel like there's any considerable wasted space or nonsensical decisions, assuming components large enough to use the volume. We suspect this is a product of DAN Case's long history of ITX case design, where every millimeter is made to count. That mindset still shows despite the A3-mATX being pushed into larger sizes than what anyone would consider small form factor. Not much gets in the way while building. It's a very simple build experience, and we think this would also make a good beginner case, contrary to what we see in some of the more complex ITX cases. The cable management's relatively Spartan. The size brute forces that aspect, but there are limited prefab cable management features. Vertical GPU mounting is inadvisable and has limited usefulness, and side mounting intake fans should be done with care. You also give up easy access to the top of the motherboard in some configurations. This market segment, though, has fierce competition from other cases that may offer more absolute value from things like included fans. Micro-ATX isn't about size purely, unlike going for ultra-small ITX builds. So some competition is also just larger. A quick list again to check out would be the Fractal Pop Air Mini RGB. We reviewed the ATX version, the Montech Air 100 m-atx, the Thermaltake View 170, the Asus AP201, and the Sama series of cases like the ARGB Q5. Other than Montech's Air 100 and Fractal's Pop series, we haven't personally had hands-on with any of these other ones, so we can't vouch for them. But we wanted you to be aware of some options as you research other reviews. So reviewing the A3-mATX is almost like a spiritual successor to the Cooler Master NR200P, in the sense that the NR200P became a go-to for relatively easy ITX, small-ish builds, especially for people who are beginners. Not to say that excludes people who are advanced builders, but it certainly makes it easier for people who are new to it. We like the A3-mATX. The thermals can be solid as long as you set it up right and kind of think about it given the information we've provided you. As always, thermals are going to be different based on every configuration that you could build with, but those were our findings. Overall, they're pretty good. We are neutral to positive on the A3-mATX. It's a straightforward, simple computer case for $70 to $85, and the quality is good for the price. So in that respect, the A3-mATX ticks the box good enough in just about every aspect, but when it's $70, good enough just becomes good. So that's our review for this one. For another relatively positive review, check out our StarForge low-key benchmarks with that pre-built computer right there. That's on the channel already. And you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help fund our in-depth testing. And we'll see you all next time.